Well, good afternoon and welcome to all of you, staff, faculty, parents, relatives, friends, spouses, partners, and of course, most importantly, the class of 2014. All right. You know, this is it. Yesterday was orientation, today is commencement. It goes quickly. This is actually the 58th commencement for the Bologna Center, and you'll now join about 7,000 others who've passed through this building. Not this building, because this is all new, which, by the way, I should stop for a minute and say to actually reorganize this so we could all be in the same room is the work of several people on the staff that I think deserve a special hand. Certainly Alessandra, Margel, Paolo, and Lorenzo, and others who really put this together so that we could be here today, and I'd like to give them a round of a hand. You see, I've got my blocking crew up here, kept in the front where I can keep track of them. But the commencements are obviously quintessentially very traditional affairs, although the traditions are not all the same. And here at the Bologna Center over time, it's become very much of a family affair. Rather informal, which squares, I think, with much of your experiences here at the center. We deal with the most serious issues in the world, but I think you would agree that our lives are lived in comfortable ambience of personal friendships and informality, mutual support between and among you, but also, I hope, between you and the faculty. It's something we treasure all the time, and it doesn't end today. In fact, next week I'm going to go to Washington to make sure that the class of 2013 is as cleaned up and presentable as all of you look today, so that they can go out into the world. That's important, and I suspect that next year Professor Plummer will come over and make sure you guys look as good as you do today. Now, I do a lot of traveling and speaking about the center to all kinds of groups and to all kinds of people, and what I always talk about is the diversity, the engagement, the sense of community that we have here, which means a lot to all of us. And I stress how important it is to what we're trying to achieve, to promote an exchange of ideas between and among people who care about ideas, and I think that's true of all of you, and who reflect their backgrounds and their different experiences and what they have to say, and I think that too is true of you. And I tell them, for someone like myself who spent a long time teaching, there's a particular joy in teaching here because of the stimulation of engaged students who do the readings, most of them, most of the time, sort of, and who challenge the faculty and challenge each other, and that they really do all of the time. And that gift of diversity, politically, culturally, geographically, is the gift you're going to bring to Washington next year, and I hope you'll share it with a new group of fellow students that you'll encounter there. Many of you will have heard me say over and over and over that the unique aspect of the SAIS experience is a year in Bologna and a year in Washington, and the contrasting perspectives of those 2 years, the ability to have what I keep repeatedly calling a debate displaced in time, where you hear different points, you will hear different points of view on many of the same subjects, and that is a richness in this experience. The classes are here only for a year, most of you, and they don't overlap with each other, and what that means is they each develop their own personality, their own characteristics that make them unique to the center. It's kind of hard to believe, but each of you comes and in a very short time we get a sense of your personality and you get a sense of ours, and it's amazing how different it can be from year to year, even with a certain sameness and the development of a sense of community, which is the same from year to year. But what actually happens does differ, and you have developed your own uniqueness here. You've been engaged, and we've seen that in particularly well-attended seminars all year long and participation in special events and experiments like Professor Cohen's exciting discussions of Shakespeare and war, and Professor Gilbert Nunger's dialogue on conceptualizing transatlantic politics, and you've produced an outstanding BC Journal of International Affairs. You have the largest number of MAIA students in the center's history. And with a very strong student government, who've done a terrific job. The clubs have been interesting. The self-organized activities like the World War II site visits that John Dellinger and company put along, they were truly impressive. In other words, you've been as alive, as congenial, as energetic, as social as the best of them, but you've also been engaged in the serious purposes of this place, the business of international affairs. Not that everything has been serious or even sober. You have continued to support the Italian agricultural sector, particularly its vineyards. I'm told that you've occasionally organized parties, well, frequently perhaps, to celebrate every conceivable event, or real or imagined. You reminded Vienna once more of our existence, and miraculously, as far as I know, as many of you returned from the weekend that had gone. And of course, Paul Stack has given a new and rich dimension to the tradition of Thanksgiving turkey. So you can be sure that the class of 2014 will be remembered by those of us who remain at the center. And I, of course, will remember you as the only terrible class that collectively duped me on Pesce d'Aprile. In truth, we're happy to have the chance to have gotten to know you and eager to greet you when you come back again. So I salute you for the mark you've made on the place, and I'll have a little more to say later, but I want now to turn the microphone over to Krista Kentola, the student government president. But first, let me say a word about student government. Student government plays an extraordinarily important part in an institution like this. We live in a very tight community. We are seriously engaged in work. It raises tensions. It can raise problems occasionally. Those problems can be solved, but they can only be solved in a particular year if student government really works at the intersection between the administration and the faculty and the rest of you, and lets us know when there are problems, helps us to work out solutions if there are solutions that can be worked out, and they can change the whole dynamic of a year. And as we say in Minnesota with Garrison Keillor, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon. This has been, in fact, a calm year in the best sense of the word. And that, for that we owe a great deal of gratitude to the student government, and I wanted to communicate that to you. So let me personally thank them and congratulate them for that, and turn the podium over to their capo. Dove.
Can you hear me? Nope. Starts very well. Yeah, I think so. Oh, it's as far as it goes. That's interesting. That's all right. I'll kind of go like this. Can you hear me now? Great. Oh, good. How about now? Great. All right, good afternoon. Director Keller, members of the faculty, staff, family, friends, fellow students, Mr. Roy Martin. Just kidding, want to see your reaction. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Kristo Kentola. I'm the president of the student government. I remember one of the first days in our auditorium on the other side of the street, not here. In pre-term, it was a presentation of strategic studies. And out of some reason, I came just a few minutes late. And I tried to open the door very quietly and sneak in. Now, normally when you come late, it doesn't go unnoticed, and when you enter, you perhaps look the person in the eyes who's sitting up here. You nod, you try to be apologetic and sit down as fast as possible without catching much attention. Well, of course, it didn't go unnoticed this time either, but unfortunately for me, it was a Professor Chesa who was presenting. And as I came in, he gave me a look that could have killed me right there on the spot. And as I walked in and tried to find an empty chair, I felt this burning sensation in my neck when he kept on staring at me until I found that chair, letting me know that this was a very bad start for me at SAIS. In fact, later on, when we were waiting for the microwave to be installed for student use, well, I won't say his name, but there was a Colombian student who suggested that food could be warmed during theories of IR by letting Professor Chesa stare at the food for a moment. Anyway, this had, of course, nothing to do with the fact that I chose totally different courses during both semesters. So when I understood that I would be giving a speech today, this was in last October, I wondered what I was supposed to say. Not all of us are graduating, most of you are still going to DC next year, and even though I'm one of the older students, I'm not the oldest. John, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'll tell you afterwards. Okay. So instead of me telling now for 10 minutes lessons in life and so on, I thought that perhaps a fun thing would be to go through the things that we've done during the past year, but rather than me talking about them, there could be a better way. So this is why I was every now and then taking videos at different parties and events. And now some are a little bit worried. But it was not, where is Camilla? It was not because I was a stalker. There was a reason for it. So I asked Karishma, who also obviously has a lot of material, to do a video about the whole year. So, oh, and just in case as this was a surprise, we took some photos from your Facebook pages. So if something is yours and you don't like it, come and tell us afterwards. Because we would like to make this video public. So, but for now, let's enjoy the video. I'll have a few words after that. Get up, get up, get up, get up. Okay, then to the formal things. As this is the last year for some here at SAIS, I want to especially thank Director Keller for being such a good director. We, the SGA, had the opportunity to participate in an advisory council dinner a few months ago, and there were several speeches in his honor by distinguished members by the council who all know him much better than I do, so based not only on my own experiences, but also on what I heard from the others. SAIS has been very fortunate to have Mr. Ken Keller as director, and I want to say thank you as the representative of all the students. Thank you. As for Margel, it's been truly a pleasure working with you for these past 9 months. We've had weekly meetings, and I think it's been a lot of fun. I'm sure that I speak for many students that we appreciated highly your advice during this year, and I think SAIS loses an asset with all the insights you have on the courses. I wish you all the best, and I hope that we meet again in the future. Thank you. As for Nelson, thank you as well. Nelson was actually the first person I was in contact with. Surprise, surprise. Admissions. We had a nice chat 18 months ago at Julio's. You bought me a coffee. I still remember that. Wish you the best of luck with your future projects, which I'm sure will be successful. Just as you have been in SAIS, I mean, you did single out all of us 200 here, the future leaders of the world, from an applicant pool of thousands and thousands of other young, bright minds, right? Thank you. So I would like to thank all three of you and ask my dear colleagues here to extend these flowers and cards, each signed by almost all of the students. Please go ahead. They can go and get the other. Go and get the other. The same goes for the rest of the faculty and staff. However, you get one pretty flower instead of a bouquet, as these are student funds and we opted for a second free drink for the students. I'll just continue here while you give the flowers. We thank you and hope that you continue working with the same passion and interest for future students, SAIS students as well. At this point, I would also like to wish Professor Plummer good luck as the future director of SAIS Europe. The SGA had the opportunity to interview the candidates for the new director, and we drafted a strong-ish letter together with the DC SGA to Dean Valley Nasser in favor of Professor Plummer, and we were and are happy to see that it is Professor Plummer who will lead SAIS Europe and do his best to ensure that our university will continue to be among the top universities in international relations also in the future. And now I have a pretty strong feeling that we forgot the wine bottle at the other side. Roy, did we forget the wine bottle? It's there? Yeah. So we will give you a wine bottle just because, well, we think that you might need a bottle of wine maybe next semester at some point. Yeah, maybe right now. Thanks also to my team, Irena, Julia, Roy, and David. I think we did a great job and had a lot of fun while doing it. Ambra is giving you small tokens of my appreciation for your effort. It's Finnish chocolate and some other stuff. And most of all, maybe a cliche, but thank you, big thanks to all of you, the students who made this year as great as it was. Please. Now, I promised I wouldn't do this ever again, but as I started this presidency with a poem, I made another one. And bear with me, some things are really hard to rhyme, so I have to get into my poetry moment here. Indeed, perhaps the best year of our lives we just had. But no worries, there will be others, so no reason to be sad. We've learned a lot of interesting things during our courses, things like trade, energy, history, and details about military forces. During the finals, I saw many worried about curves, supply and demand, while others were already outside enjoying the weather and getting tanned. We will miss SAIS, Italy, the gelato, and all the food, not to mention the wine that always put us in such a good mood. Now, it's good to keep in mind that our degree is in international relations, and whether it be between NGOs, private companies, or even nations, in the end, it is about interaction between humans in different organizations. Our actions in the future will not only be based on time spent in classrooms these years, but also our values, integrity, personality, and things we've learned having a few beers. So yes, inside or outside of SAIS, a fact is that a great deal we have learned, and yet many of us think about the future and employment keeps us concerned. Not me at all. Now you will get whatever job because you are the best of the best. Well, it might not be that easy, and it's likely you're going to be a bit stressed. I'm confident, though, that the SAIS degree will open many doors. Remember your SAIS network, and perhaps that job you want will be yours. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life, Steve Jobs said. I think it made sense, so I included it here so that it would be read. So do in life what you want to do, look for the job you want, and forget about what the others think. Do it for the reasons you think are important, and if you need advice, ask a SAISer for a drink. To conclude, any one of you with a big couch in DC, I have to give a warning. I just might surprise you next year and stand outside your door one morning. Congratulations to every single one of you. Good memories. From here, we will have quite a few. Now I'll stop, and we'll still have a few more speeches, all right? But after that, let's start this commencement party with all its might.
We get this back down where I can use it. Great job, really great. And I think it reinforced what I said about both the informality and the closeness of this school and this group and this experience for you. We're going to move on and do some things now that are somewhat formal. Most of you know that C. Grove Haynes was the first director of the Bologna Center. It was his idea. He sold it first to SAIS, and SAIS sold itself to Hopkins, and one thing led to another. But Grove Haynes, in his honor, we've established these Grove Haynes prizes, which are intended to reward particularly the writing that students do in each of the areas that we teach here. And so we have a set of awards, the Grove Haynes Awards, and each of them will be presented by one of the faculty members who has been part of reviewing the submissions and the nominations for those awards. We start with international economics, and did I understand that you were going to do it, Filippo? Va bene.
So the paper that we are going to award today is a paper that speaks about health and economics, something that has been developing quite substantially in the last few years. And it's a paper that takes two well-used measures of inequality and adapts them to the notion of health and actually to how to measure inequality in health outcome. It's a kind of original and policy-relevant work that we like to see here. And this is why we award the Lauren Aleci Hartel for her paper on health inequity and index.
We turn next to the fearful Professor Marco Chiesa to talk about international areas.
Okay, so I have read many historians. Thomas Hobbes wrote at one point, but there is none that pleased me more like Thucydides. Likewise, I have read many papers this year, but there is none that pleased me like the one I'm going to talk about. In the past, and my colleagues have seen that a number of times, all I used to receive as nominations were papers in conflict management. So much so, I often had the impression of being surrounded by bizarre creatures who wanted to save the world, which would make me lose appetite, cheerfulness, sleep, and occasionally good health. You know, cultural trends now fashionable in the West favor an approach to international politics based on the odd belief that war is bad, peace is good, and conflict has to be managed. All I wanted was a paper that would go beyond that and adopted a more realistic, not realist, but realistic perspective. Who could ask for more? So the paper I have selected this year meets these basic requirements. It deals with US foreign policy, or better still, with some procedural aspects of US foreign policy, i.e. the delicate relationship between the President and Congress when it comes to war powers. The other has nicely combined law, history, and political science, a truly interdisciplinary effort, and has analyzed how legal and political considerations have coexisted and affected each other for 40 years, all of which is all the more relevant in light of the interventionist style that has characterized US foreign policy after the Cold War. The paper is very well researched, well argued, well structured. Historical reconstruction is coupled with very interesting critical insights. Overall, it is both informative and analytical. Its title is The Law of the Stronger. I love that. Failures of the War Powers Resolution and Lessons for Reform. The only problem is that its author is not with us today. It has fled Bologna, I am told. Still, let's acknowledge with a huge applause the winner of the Haynes Prize in International Policy, Mr. Sean Finlan.
Professor Chiesa has had it in for peace for a very long time. The next presentation is by Professor Mark Gilbert, and it covers regions of the world.
A bit difficult to follow, Marco, always. Imagine an art gallery. You go into an art gallery and you see 7 or 8 wonderful, glowing, original pictures on the wall. It's not easy to decide which is the best. I we found ourselves rather in this situation when we were discussing the prize, the essays nominated for the Regional Studies Prize. On the other hand, if you see that one artist on the wall has contributed not one, but two exceptionally original and vibrant canvases to the exhibition, you sit up and pay attention. And the winner of the Rose Haynes Prize for the Regions of the World did exactly this. He wrote a paper for me on Leonardo Sciascia, the Italian writer, which was one of the most original papers I've ever read, and which will make me totally rethink the way I teach the book the next time I teach it. But what really tipped the balance for him was that he also wrote what I think is not only the best thing written by a student on Italian politics just recently, but one of the most innovative things written by anybody on Italian politics just recently. And it's an essay entitled Rethinking the Democratic Web, the case of Beppe Grillo's 5 Stars movement and the Internet as a tool for political legitimation, which he wrote for Professor Eric Jones's Europe Research Institute seminar. The winner, as some of you will have guessed by now, is Francesco Genovese.
You'll notice that the winners show you the certificate and kind of hide the envelope with the money in it. John Harper.
Well, Patrick McCarthy, wherever he is, would be absolutely delighted to know that we have just awarded a paper to someone who wrote a paper on Leonardo Sciascia, so my congratulations too. And I want to read the paper, by the way. So, I'm here to award the Haynes Prize to the best MAIA thesis category, and I'm going to read you the citation. There is a growing debate regarding the importance of macroeconomic imbalances in the global economy as a whole, and in the Eurozone in particular. This debate has generated important changes in European policy design. The macroeconomic imbalance assessment and procedure that the European Commission conducts every year on all member countries is the most visible sign of these changes. This thesis studies the reasons why the procedure was introduced, identifying the steps that have led the Eurozone economies to diverge, and studying the specific role that fiscal policies may have had in facilitating convergence across European countries and ultimately the survival of the euro. By the way, as Ken pointed out, there are real euros in this envelope. And of European integration. In particular, the thesis shows how fiscal policy can be made more efficient if we shift our focus from sanctions to incentives. Remarkably, let me add, this thesis was written while the author was simultaneously undergoing the rigorous basic training of the German Foreign Service. Congratulations to Andreas Glossner.
Good, good. Now we move on. There's I mentioned the idea of tradition and our traditions across the street. It's a little awkward to talk about tradition when you're in this part of the part of the city of Bologna, because it's going to be about another 900 years before the Bologna Center is half as old as the University of Bologna. So we've got a ways to wait. But one tradition we've tried to join in is the tradition of awards that go to people who have earned a degree today, and we have several who I hope we can get up here, and we will individually present to them the laurel wreath, which is traditional in the University of Bologna. Now, Margell, I need your help.
Hi, everybody. This is my favorite time of year, where I get to read the individual names for the students who are graduating from the Bologna Center. I'm going to ask that all of the MAIA graduates come down and line up here. The first MAIA graduate is Sarah Agostini from Italy. The next graduate is Zoe Campiglia from France. The next graduate is Maude Demont from France. The next graduate is Andreas Glossner from Germany. The next graduate is Silvia Pavese from Italy. The next graduate is Victoria Perez de Agreda Murray from Spain. The next graduate is Lisa Maria Schwartz from Austria. Last but not least, Raphaël Zenedis from France. I also want to mention that we have one more MIAI graduate who could not be here today. That's Christophe Van Damme from Belgium. Now I'm going to ask all of the MIPP graduates to come down and join us in the front of the room. For our guests, the MIPP is a one-year professional degree. Each of the students here has between 7 and 9 years of work experience and contribute a great deal to the class, and we're delighted to have them. The first graduate is Anthea Blakey from Australia. The second graduate is John Dellinger, again from Australia. The next graduate is Vahid Jahangiri from the United States. The next graduate is Kristo Kantala from Finland. The next graduate is Amrit Nandra from UK. Our next graduate is Richard Stevens from the United States. Last but not least, Luigi Valeri from Italy. I also want to mention that Christian Fredrickson, otherwise known as Chris Fred sometimes, is also graduating as an MIPP this year. He's not here. Last but not least, I'd like to invite our MA students who are graduating from the Bologna Center. Christopher Hume. From the US. And finally, Talia Wizanski from the United States. The third MA student who is graduating this semester but couldn't be with us is Ian Moulton from the United States. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all, and thank you, Margelle. And we turn now to an award actually to one of our faculty members. The Johns Hopkins Alumni Association makes available an award each year to each school for the outstanding faculty member, and that's one that you choose. We chose the ones you heard earlier, but you choose the faculty member to be rewarded, and the reward or the competition is only open to adjunct faculty, none of the full-time faculty, in large part because we depend so heavily on them to provide the kind of breadth of possibilities that make it reasonable for you to be here, for us to have a small staff, and yet for you to have many, many choices in your courses. The winner this year was undeniably ahead of all the other voting. It was Arntrud Hartmann. Yeah. And we told Arntrud about it last week, and she was totally delighted and really very, very appreciative. And she wrote the following, which she asked me to read to all of you. I want to thank my students profoundly for this honor. It was a joy teaching them with their enthusiasm, curiosity, and willingness to try out new teaching approaches. I'd like to thank my students in particular for their flexibility and patience. Due to a serious illness in my family, the last 8 months were very difficult for me. Trying to keep on teaching was a real challenge. The weekly travels from Berlin to Bologna were tiring, but once arrived and working with my students was uplifting and rewarding. Thank you for what I know, for that, and I know we will cross paths with many of you in the future professional roles as development practitioners. I very much look forward to that. That was from Arna. So what's next? I see. If I had a hat, I would change hats at this point. I'm no longer the MC. I am now the commencement speaker. Now, obviously, that's a bit unusual, but I'd like to present it as an effort on our part to save money, to keep tuition down. But I'm afraid it would be a stretch. However, what it does do is spare you a fulsome and drawn-out introduction. My introduction is what you see is what you get. The truth, of course, as I think most of you know, is that this isn't only a rite of passage for all of you, but a rite of passage for me as well. You're moving on, I'm moving over. You're finishing a year in Bologna, I'm finishing 50 years of teaching. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, The truth is, I have to say, it's been a terrific and satisfying way to spend my adult life, and especially so in the 8 years that I've been director of the center. So how best mark the occasion? The general guidelines for commencement speakers are to be wise, funny, and brief. The fallback position is to choose any two, as long as one of them is brief. Well, at least sort of brief, which isn't all that easy in this case, because I want to talk about SAIS. I want to talk about its role in your world, its role in the wider world, and how it goes about doing its thing. So the question is where to begin. I've spent a long time wandering through the world of higher education, starting with what I clearly remember as the exhilarating revelations that come with an undergraduate degree in liberal arts. But I moved on to the very traditional chemical engineering training and plunged ahead with graduate study, where I was able to be part of the creation of an entirely new field of biomedical engineering, and then to a career of teaching, research, and ultimately university administration that brought all those strands together. Of course, it moved me inexorably in the direction of international studies, as any chemical engineering degree would. I would like to explain all of that to you, but that would violate the brief stricture. But there is a story to be told, and at least a commentary and some observations on what goes on in universities and what we hope goes on in SAIS. Comments that I hope fit with the swan song that this is for me, but the midpoint that it is for you, at least in terms of this particular school experience. I think, well, let's say I postulate, if you want, that the work of scholarship, the work of learning, the work of preparing for a career, in other words, what we hope we do here, can be summed up in a phrase, and that phrase would be to strive to ask the right questions. And what I mean by that is what the rest of this talk is about. Some of you may remember an anecdote I told earlier this year, or I think I did, because you may have heard that the comment that someone reaches an age where the things they remember best really never happened. So I'm not sure, but let's assume I did. Anyway, the anecdote was about one of our sons who, when he was about 3 or 4, was playing with friends on a very hot day in Minnesota. Yes, it gets hot in Minnesota. And one of the kids in the group was wearing mittens. Well, an adult, read a wise older person, passed by, noticed the kid, and asked, "Well, what's the matter, little boy? Are your hands cold?" To which one of the other kids responded with a puzzled look, "Well, his hands aren't cold, he's wearing mittens." Well, the lesson, of course, is it matters how you frame questions, because they almost always contain assumptions and presumptions about common understanding of the facts. And in our field, not only are the facts at issue, but so too are the values, the meaning, the importance, the implications of terms like progress, freedom, culture, the appropriate goals of society and the rights of states, what we believe are the motivations of individuals. What are the things we seek to optimize? What are reasonable costs to absorb in doing so? It all plays into framing questions. In fact, one way of viewing academic disciplines is that they merely represent different ways of doing that. But there's only one reality. And in that respect, the disciplines are merely different lenses, different facets, different ways of querying the same set of facts, the same range of values, really the same world. And that's why we place so much stress in SAIS on a multidisciplinary commitment. But there's more to the story. We tend to think of scholarship as a search for answers, no easy task. But one of the important early lessons in research is that getting the answers is actually considerably easier than asking the questions. And easier still if you do a good job on the questions. For example, if your question is, what is the meaning of life? It's clearly of interest and importance. But don't hold your breath about getting an answer to it in your lifetime. On the other hand, choosing a question that can be easily answered is hardly a better alternative if both the question and the answer are trivial. So in that sense, what we strive for, what we should strive for, is to frame questions of broad enough scope that their answers will be useful and significant, but not so broad that you'll never get to an answer. And that's the sweet spot. That's the goal. Now, there's another facet to the question framing challenge. SAIS is, in an important respect, a professional school. heard Christo talking about getting jobs, which is a good idea. We especially appreciate that later. But we want to provide our students with a practical preparation for careers in international affairs. But what does that mean with respect to what we teach, with respect to what questions we ask in our classes? When do our students, what do you need to know? It's a question that all schools of international affairs confront. And a couple of years ago, a very thoughtful commentator, Robert Gallucci, who is the president of the MacArthur Foundation, wrote an interesting piece on the subject, strongly supporting the multidisciplinary approach we enthusiastically support, the important role of economics, the need for a global perspective, which is also obviously a key strength of SAIS. But he added a comment that struck me as needing a closer look. He said that if we wanted to learn what our students needed to know, we should ask the practitioners, the people doing international affairs in government, the private sector, and the world of NGOs. That's not so clear. It reminded me of the history of the discipline I started out in, chemical engineering. Chemical engineering had arisen as a field to serve the chemical and the petroleum industries. Its courses, the courses I took as an undergraduate, dealt with how to design oil pipelines, distillation columns, heat exchangers, extrusion machines, huge chemical reaction kettles, and how to put them all together in oil refineries and the like. I even had a laboratory on crushing and grinding. Very practical. All of that because that's what the practitioners said you needed to know. And it was useful. And by the way, it still is useful. In fact, if you ever got, perhaps you got a chance to go to the Barilla factory in Parma. But if you did, you saw wonderful examples of extrusion, of how to extrude pasta. Nice. Actually, I enjoyed it very much. But, you know, there's different tastes for different people. But that approach was a formula for stagnation. And in fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, everything changed in engineering education. Instead of asking questions guided by the applications to which the knowledge was put at the time, engineers began to frame research, organize education, pose questions in terms of the fundamental disciplines and the larger conceptual frameworks that underlay the applications. Instead of oil pipelines, there was fluid mechanics. Instead of distillation, there was heat and mass transfer. Instead of reactor design, there was thermodynamics and catalysis. And out of those reconceptualizations came many of the technologies that have developed since then. Secondary and tertiary oil recovery, new materials in the development of the field of nanotechnology, the production of biomass fuels, synthetic substitutes for many of the materials in short supply. And also, significantly, chemical engineers suddenly found that when they posed their questions in those ways, they could provide important insights in fields other than the chemical and petroleum industry. So I worked for most of my adult research career in medical problems, in understanding medical conditions and helping to alleviate them. And we're helping in the environment, improving food supplies. Well, how then does this relate to the challenge of graduate education and international relations? Is there a similar danger that education aimed at dealing with problems as they are, or as we view them today, may be less than optimal in preparing students to deal with change, in fact, to promote change? Well, personally, I think so. Next year, the Bologna Center will celebrate its 60th anniversary. We opened our doors in 1955 in a world that was very different from the one in which we now live. It was only 8 years after George Kennan's famous X article was published in Foreign Affairs proposing the strategy of containment in a bipolar world. And of course, that became the defining, the existential description of world affairs in the Cold War. It framed essentially every question we raised in connection with international affairs, every assumption, every presumption about our common goals, and it certainly affected what we taught. Let me share with you a sample of the courses offered in that first year. Soviet law, public opinion and propaganda, political parties in Italy. There were separate courses for political parties in France, Germany, and Austria. Labor organizations, the dynamics of U.S. economic policies in Europe, governmental structures for the conduct of foreign affairs. Those were all actual titles of courses from that first year. By 1963, 1964, we'd added a compulsory seminar series on the Atlantic Community and European integration, a course on contemporary Eastern Europe, the satellite states, another on monopoly control in the United States. What comes through in these titles is the nature of the underlying questions. They were descriptive rather than analytical. They were narrowly focused rather than broad. They clearly were oriented to the ideas of the totally dominant role of nation states and the formal institutions of government, clearly based on even reinforcing the assumption of the bipolar world that followed World War II. The accepted, if unwritten, goals that underlay the questions we were asking at the time were pretty clear. Strengthen the transatlantic relationship, combat, at least with words we hoped, communism, engage the youth of Europe and Italy, spread American values. What has changed since then? Well, essentially everything. Of course, starting with the disappearance of the Cold War, but much, much more. For a while, we thought we'd move to a unipolar world, a world with one superpower. In the 90s, we talked about an empire of the willing. The limitations of those concepts quickly became obvious. We tried to conceive of a multipolar world, but it became apparent that that was too simplistic a framing concept. It was too state-centered. We saw the emergence of non-state actors, the new kinds of ethnic conflict, the rise of Asia as a region of economic power, the development of information technology, and a consequent shift of power from government to non-government organizations. You know, how quaint does the term propaganda seem today? We don't use it very much in those terms, but also the economic instabilities that were probably one unintended consequence of the new IT tools that became available. We witnessed, in fact, we're still witnessing the change in the nature of warfare that information technology has brought, with new vulnerabilities, the obsolescence of the traditional battlefield, the overlapping of civilian and military targets, and as a consequence, the perceived need to impose restrictions on civil society in the interests of security. If you've been on the waiting lines at airports these days, for example, the emergence of new ethical questions concerning the alteration of life forms through genetic manipulation, and of course, the linkages and the coupled concerns of energy, environment, and natural resources. Now, very little that we studied in 1955, very few of the questions we asked would have prepared us for any of these new challenges, for any of today's challenges. That's a humbling statement, but an important reminder that addressing today's problems does not necessarily prepare leaders to deal with tomorrow's problems. And therefore, there's always a need, a continuing need, to identify robust organizing themes, question framing approaches, analytical frameworks that will identify which underlying elements in today's problems will always be relevant, although perhaps not in the same form. And of course, in the time since the Bologna Center opened its doors, there have been many attempts by scholars to identify those kinds of organizing themes. Frank Fukuyama's famous monograph on the end of history and the last man, Sam Huntington's 1993 essay on the clash of civilizations are two particularly ambitious and rich examples, different examples. The first was organized questions around the issue of competing political structural paradigms. The second around ethnic and national identities. They were rich, not because they were right, but because they generated dialogue. They invited ways of explaining the present, but they also strove to place the present in the stream of history from past to future. There are two examples of what it has always seemed to me is meant by the term narrative, ways of telling stories that move beyond the description of the facts. They create a worldview that informs the questions they ask. They can be enlightening context, but they can also be distorting visions, forcing the answers as well as framing the questions. Because as the saying goes, when you have a hammer, everything seems to look like a nail. Now, the forefront of science in the 21st century is biology, and molecular biology to ecology are particularly ripe areas rich with narratives ranging from when life begins to what constitutes a natural system, an organ for that matter, or for that matter, what's an organism. For example, the Gaia hypothesis is a rather extreme ecological model. It suggests that the Earth and everything that's part of it actually is only one big organism, a bit lumbering, but exquisitely interdependent. Interestingly, at the same time, there was a popular view put forth about two decades ago by Lewis Thomas that suggested that really the only fundamental life form was a single cell. And the consequence was, for example, when we went out of the house to take a walk, it was a joint enterprise of our millions of cells deciding to take us for the walk rather than the other way around. Well, of course, some narratives are a bit less extreme and at the same time are more likely to be exported from one field to another. Some in particular toward our own field of international relations. In recent years, for example, the shift in science from deterministic conceptions to probabilistic conceptions, from a belief in ultimately reductionist ideas, if not simple explanations of physical phenomena, to a world characterized by complexity, by strong linkages among the multiple parts of the system, has promoted a systems perspective that you often hear in the social sciences, as well as an emphasis on framing questions in terms of systems. As E.B. White put it plaintively, I love it, there is no limit to how complicated things can get on account of one thing always leading to another. That's well put. Well, how does all of that affect SAIS and how does it affect you? Well, for SAIS, or at least for those of us who teach at SAIS, there's the constant need to find better questions, more robust questions, questions to guide thinking about where the world is going as well as where it's been or where it is, and importantly, what that implies about analytical frameworks, the kinds of tools that hold most promise for helping to shape the future. Out of those efforts are born new courses. I think of Professor Jones's Risk in International Political Economy, Professor Gilbert's Intellectuals and Politics, Professor Harper's Debate course, or even my own efforts in Science, Technology, and International Affairs. Out of that same drive come experiments like Professor Cohen's Tour de Force on Shakespeare and War. Those are all important elements in changing what we do and thinking more about the future. Now, there's currently a debate going on at SAIS on the role of core courses. A number of you may have been involved in that discussion. The conventional wisdom has been that these are the courses that are intended to expose students to material that is absolutely vital for all students of international affairs to know. Wisdom hasn't quite come to grips with the fact that we expect students to take 2 of those 4 courses, which seems to suggest that we would like to ensure that students leave SAIS knowing about half of what is absolutely vital for them to know. But let me put that aside. The question has been reframed this year to focus on whether the core courses are intended to ensure that everyone entering graduate school in international affairs has some common knowledge, or whether or not they're intended to introduce new ways of thinking, and in that respect, to provide a deeper foundation in certain aspects of international affairs that students can build on in their individual programs of study. Frankly, that question may not find an answer in the near future, or at least before you graduate from SAIS, all of you. But the take-home lesson in these brief remarks is that the most practical education is the one that prepares you for tomorrow, not today, and the one and that comes from some deeper understanding of the structures that govern the political, social, economic, and cultural lives of people individually and collectively. Most of you have another year to spend at SAIS. Let me urge you to make it truly a satisfying year by choosing the courses that ask the most fundamental questions. But let me also urge you to make it the truly practical year, again, by choosing the courses that appear to ask the most fundamental questions, the most open-ended questions, because it's probably a good bet that your guess today about where you'll be 5 years from now is going to be wrong. It's always been that way for me. So it's wise to be sure as you take that trip that you have in hand the equivalent of a raincoat and sunscreen and maybe some extra batteries, by which I mean a sense of how to ask the right questions. 2 more observations and I'm finished. First, goals are important, but experiences probably more so. We've enclosed with your program Konstantin Cavafy's poem Ithaca, which is a magnificent expansion on that theme, and my gift to all of you. Second, I'm often asked what people do with a SAIS degree. I tell them that that's easy. They change the world. Not all at once, and not so much as they'd like, but inexorably. So given my confidence that you'll live up to that billing, let me offer a line from Robert Browning. A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Now, you'd think that the husband of Elizabeth Barrett Browning would have had the good sense to include women in that comment, as of course I do, even if he didn't. But I endorse it, and I wish you all good luck in these coming years. Okay. Oh, thank you.
Good afternoon, class of 2014, right? If you're all checking your email, I think I were in trade. But anyway, I was asked to give some closing remarks, so I indeed will be very brief. But first, I think it's important to underscore how much we're going to miss Ken. Ken isn't a SAIS grad, and well, he's academically handicapped in that regard. Has overcome the deficiency very quickly, and I think really, not kidding, he loves this place as much as the old-timers and the alumni. Okay. We've all benefited from his great intellect, and as you've seen from his wit, and we're going to miss it terribly, especially since the next director is just a glorified accountant. Okay. One regret I do have is I was never able to persuade him about the inherent benefits of economics. And, but I would like to underscore the fact that we are still young, and there's more in economics than you dream of in that little red book, or whatever the hell it is you read. Okay. No, and anyway, this really is a sad occasion, but it's mitigated by the fact that our knowledge that he's going to be back teaching with us in the spring. And so future SAIS classes will also be able to benefit from him. And so we'll all look forward to these future debates displaced in time, Ken. So, okay, so now let's focus on the class of 2014 now. I think that it is the fate of the SAIS professor that we only get to see you for 1 year, or at least most of you for 1 year. Now, that isn't always a bad thing. But it certainly is a bad thing this year. So, and of course, every SAIS class has special characteristics. And I think that, you know, while, as Ken would say, the plural of anecdote is not evidence, I've seen a good number of you in my classes. As a matter of fact, only the lucky few have been able to escape my clutches. Okay. But I wanted to make 3 points. First would be that, you know, all SAIS classes, I would say, are intelligent. But what I really liked about this class is this academic curiosity that I really have to say is so gratifying to the faculty. I mean, that really is something that it's really the reason why we love to be in the classroom. And I think this class has excelled in that. So I really hope that you keep that you remember in DC that you're here at SAIS to learn from your faculty, learn from your fellow students, and worry a lot less about making photocopies at the Treasury. Okay, don't take your internships. Internships are important, but don't go overboard with them. Okay. Secondly, the class has a strong esprit de corps, and I think we've seen this. We've seen this here today. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I think that this class has clicked as well as any class that I've seen, and so that's very important, I think, because that's one of the things that that we really relish here at SAIS Europe. And third, I think, is that you were tranquilli. Okay, I was one of the fortunate faculty members to see you in preterm. And for some of you, preterm was a bit of a surprise, but you converged towards a happy equilibrium very quickly. Okay, so, and this is, this suggests that your endogenous variables form a very stable system, right? So that bodes well for the future. Okay, I told you it was going to be brief. Okay, so speaking of this, on behalf of my colleagues, let me wish you a wonderful year next year. And I'm personally going to be in DC a bit more beginning in the fall and look forward to seeing you there, provided you don't have exams or internships or soap operas to watch or whatever. So anyway, finally, it's my pleasure to invite you across the street to join us at the Penthouse and at Giulio for the reception. So again, congrats to everybody.